Modern Americans often debate liberty as though it were merely one political option among many, as if freedom and government control are simply competing preferences on life's menu. But history tells a far different story. Individual liberty is not mankind's default condition. It is civilization's rarest achievement. For thousands of years, the overwhelming majority of humanity never possessed what Americans now routinely take for granted. They did not freely choose their occupations. They could not criticize their rulers without fear. They had no right to own property secure from arbitrary confiscation. They possessed no meaningful freedom of speech, religion, or assembly. Their governments answered to no constitution, no Bill of Rights, and certainly not to the consent of the governed. Instead, rulers governed because they possessed the sword. From the pharaohs of Egypt to the emperors of Rome, from the dynasties of China to the caliphates of the Middle East, and from medieval monarchies to the absolute kings of Europe, nearly every civilization concentrated power into the hands of a tiny ruling class. Whether crowned with gold, clothed in military uniforms, or draped in revolutionary slogans, governments have consistently exhibited the same instinct: expand authority while limiting the freedom of those they govern. Consider the numbers. Human civilization stretches back roughly 6,000 years. For nearly all of that time, constitutional republics recognizing broad individual rights scarcely existed. Democracy itself was exceedingly rare, often limited to privileged classes while excluding women, slaves, foreigners, and the poor. Even the celebrated republics of Greece and Rome offered only fragments of the liberty modern Americans inherited. The American experiment, beginning in 1776 and constitutionally established in 1789, represented something astonishingly new. Never before had a nation been intentionally built upon the revolutionary premise that government exists to protect pre-existing rights rather than dispense privileges. The founders did not invent liberty, they recognized it. John Locke had argued that rights belonged to individuals by nature, not by permission. Montesquieu warned against concentrated power. The Scottish Enlightenment explained how free markets generated prosperity without central planning. Yet America became the first nation to embed these principles into a written constitution whose primary purpose was not empowering government, but restraining it. That distinction changed history. Since then, liberty has spread, but only partially and often temporarily. The British Empire gradually embraced constitutional government. Western Europe adopted representative institutions. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, and several others developed societies that broadly respected individual freedom. Even today, however, these nations represent only a fraction of humanity. Nearly half the world's population still lives under authoritarian governments. Communist China alone governs well over 1 billion people under extensive censorship, surveillance, and political control. North Korea remains perhaps the closest approximation of total slavery ever created by a modern state. Russia imprisons political opponents. Iran enforces religious conformity. Cuba suppresses dissent. Venezuela demonstrates how quickly prosperous societies can descend into economic collapse once liberty yields to centralized power. History reveals an uncomfortable lesson. Freedom is difficult to establish. It is even harder to preserve. The 20th century alone witnessed the rise of Nazism, fascism, Soviet communism, Maoism, Khmer Rouge Cambodia, and countless military dictatorships throughout Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Collectively, these governments murdered well over 100 million people outside the casualties of war. Nearly everyone promised security, equality, justice, or national greatness before demanding obedience. Liberty rarely disappears overnight. It erodes incrementally. Rights become privileges. Privileges become permits. Permits become prohibitions. Eventually, citizens discover they possess only those freedoms government officials choose to tolerate. The American founders understood this reality perhaps better than any statesman before or since. They did not assume elected officials would somehow become morally superior to kings. Instead, they designed a constitutional system based upon human nature itself. The Constitution's architecture reflected profound skepticism toward concentrated authority precisely because history offered overwhelming evidence that unchecked governments eventually become oppressive regardless of their original intentions. Many Americans assume liberty is inevitable because they have never experienced its absence. Generations raised under constitutional protections naturally begin viewing those protections as permanent features of civilization rather than extraordinary historical anomalies. But nothing could be further from the truth. If one were to estimate humanity's experience over the past 6 millennia, less than 5% of all people who have ever lived enjoyed any protections resembling modern constitutional liberty. Even among those fortunate enough to live in relatively free societies, those freedoms often existed only briefly before war, revolution, conquest, or authoritarian movements extinguished them. Liberty is not history's norm, it is history's miracle. That reality places extraordinary responsibility upon Americans. The United States has never been perfect. It has repeatedly fallen short of its founding principles. Yet the proper response to imperfection is not abandoning liberty, but extending its protections more faithfully. America's greatest strength has never been flawless government. It has been a constitutional framework capable of correcting injustice while preserving freedom. Should that framework disappear, the consequences would spread worldwide. For nearly 2.5 centuries, the United States has served as history's brightest demonstration that free people can govern themselves, build unprecedented prosperity, and protect individual rights without requiring authoritarian control. Countless reform movements across the globe have pointed toward America as evidence that liberty is practical, not merely philosophical. If America ceases to be a beacon of liberty, tyrants everywhere would celebrate. Those yearning for liberty would lose their greatest example. History would not remember such a moment as merely an American tragedy. It would remember it as the dimming of civilization's brightest flame. For liberty is not humanity's inheritance, it is humanity's highest achievement, and achievements survive only as long as those who inherit them possess the wisdom and the courage to defend them.
Can you say why America is the greatest country in the world?
Freedom and freedom. So let's keep it that way.
I think that the real job that we have that confronts us is to somehow be able to sell our fellow Americans on the moral superiority of personal liberty.
I would remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice.